Martha lived in a quiet suburban neighborhood, tucked away from the hustle and bustle of the city. A woman in her early 70s, she had spent her life working as a nurse and caring for others, always putting the needs of her children and those around her above her own. She was well known in the community for her selflessness, and her house was often filled with the laughter of children and friends, as she opened her doors to anyone who needed a warm meal or a place to stay. To many, she was a saint, a woman who had seen her fair share of hardships but always maintained a positive attitude. Her 3 children, Sarah, David, and Tom, were all grown now, each living their own lives. Sarah, the eldest, had been the most independent, often putting distance between herself and Martha, even though they had once shared a close bond. David, the middle child, had been the most devoted, always checking in on Martha and trying to help when he could, though his busy work schedule often got in the way. Tom, the youngest, was quiet and reserved, often seen as the good son, who did just enough to stay out of trouble but never seemed to really connect with his mother on a deeper level. On the surface, Martha's family seemed perfectly normal. They gathered together on holidays, shared a few laughs, and occasionally caught up over the phone. But beneath the surface, there were unresolved tensions, unspoken words, and lingering resentments that had been building for years. Martha, always the peacemaker, never forced the issue. She believed that time would heal everything, that her children would one day understand the value of family and the love she had always given them. But as the years passed, the cracks in her relationships with Sarah, David, and Tom only deepened. Sarah had moved away to start a family of her own, but her visits to Martha grew increasingly infrequent. She seemed to forget the kindness Martha had always shown her, even during the times when she was struggling with her own issues. David, though always the most attentive, began to get caught up in his career, his own dreams taking priority over his mother's needs. Tom, quiet as ever, never seemed to fully understand his mother's struggles, or perhaps he just didn't want to. Martha's health had been declining for some time, though her children had been too preoccupied with their own lives to notice. The signs were there: she had been slower on her feet, her energy levels waned, and she had a persistent cough that wouldn't go away. But Martha, ever proud and independent, refused to admit that she needed help. It wasn't until she had an unexpected fall in her living room that her children were forced to confront the reality of her health. Even then, Sarah, who had been estranged for years, was the last to show up, only appearing when the situation seemed dire. This infuriated David and Tom, who had been making efforts to check in on her more regularly. Their mother had been suffering in silence, but they had been too wrapped up in their own lives to realize it. As Martha recovered from her fall, her health continued to deteriorate. She wasn't the vibrant woman she once was. Her once glowing smile had become a faint reflection of its former self, and her eyes, which had always been so full of warmth and love, now looked tired and distant. It was clear to those around her that she didn't have much time left. But despite the gravity of the situation, her children couldn't seem to come together to support her. They all still harbored their grievances, small and large. Sarah, who had always been the most independent and vocal, felt slighted by Martha's demands over the years, believing that her mother had been overly dependent on her help. David felt guilty for not being able to do more, but his guilt often turned to frustration, especially when he saw Sarah's reluctance to be involved. Tom, for his part, remained distant. Perhaps he just didn't know how to handle the emotions of it all. The topic of Martha's will had come up a few times over the years, but it was always brushed aside in casual conversation. Martha had always told her children that there was no rush, everything would be settled when the time came. Yet, there was a lingering sense of unease among them, an unspoken tension that none of them could quite shake. They knew, deep down, that this moment was coming, but no one wanted to admit it. So, life went on, and the family continued with their strained, surface-level interactions, each one waiting for the inevitable. On a particularly crisp autumn day, Martha went for a walk in the park, something she used to do every morning. She loved the fresh air and the calming routine of walking through the streets she had known for decades. She had always believed that nature provided clarity, and as she walked, her mind wandered back to her children, her pride and joy, and yet her deepest heartaches. The walk was slow, her steps labored, but Martha took her time, savoring the peace around her. Little did she know that this would be the last time she would walk these familiar streets. That evening, she collapsed in her home, and by morning, she was gone. When the phone call came that Martha had passed away, it was as if everything had suddenly frozen in time. Her children, who had been living their separate lives, were immediately thrust back into the reality they had long avoided. The house that once felt like a sanctuary now felt empty. The grief was heavy, but so too was the anticipation of what was to come. None of them had fully prepared for the will reading, and as they made their way to the lawyer's office, a strange sense of unease hung in the air. They were about to find out more than they were prepared for, about their mother, their relationships with her, and each other. Little did they know, Martha's death would change everything. The day of the will reading arrived with an air of tension that none of Martha's children could shake off. The lawyer's office, a sterile, almost clinical place, felt like an alien environment compared to the warmth of their childhood home. The siblings, who hadn't been in the same room together for months, exchanged strained glances as they sat around a large wooden table. David shifted nervously in his chair, while Tom sat silently, his eyes fixed on the floor. Sarah, as always, was the first to break the silence, tapping her fingers impatiently on the table, but even her usual bravado couldn't mask the anxiety that lingered in the air. The lawyer, a tall, elderly man named Mr. Jenkins, entered the room with a folder of papers in his hand. He greeted them somberly, his professional demeanor adding to the weight of the moment. As he sat down and began to organize the documents, the siblings fell into a deep silence, each wondering what their mother had left for them, or perhaps, what she hadn't. The lawyer cleared his throat and began to speak, his voice deep and steady. "I understand that this is a difficult time for all of you, but we must proceed with the reading of your mother's last wishes." He paused, looking at each of them in turn before continuing. "I trust you're all aware that your mother's estate is sizable, though not without complications." At the mention of their mother's estate, Sarah leaned forward, her eyes narrowing slightly. The word sizable didn't sit well with her. She had always been the one to assume that Martha had accumulated wealth over the years. Her mother had lived frugally, after all. David, on the other hand, was already thinking about the property and the small inheritance they might receive to ease their lives. But none of them were prepared for what came next. Mr. Jenkins opened the folder, glancing down at the first page of the will. "I'll begin with the first clause," he said, his voice measured but with a hint of something deeper underneath. "Sarah, you will not be receiving any part of your mother's estate." The words hung in the air like a bombshell, and for a moment, there was only stunned silence. Sarah blinked, her face a mixture of disbelief and fury. "What do you mean, not receiving anything?" she demanded, her voice rising. "This must be a mistake." She shot an accusatory look at David and Tom, as if they were in on some secret. But David was just as stunned, his mouth slightly agape. Tom, who rarely spoke up, shifted in his seat uncomfortably, glancing at his siblings. Mr. Jenkins remained calm, looking at Sarah with a mix of empathy and professionalism. "Your mother left no assets to you, Sarah. She stated clearly in her will that you had been removed from her list of beneficiaries due to your treatment of her in her final years." The word stung, and Sarah recoiled as though she had been physically struck. Her mind raced to process what had just been said. She knew her relationship with her mother had been strained, but never in a million years had she imagined that it would come to this. David and Tom exchanged confused glances, both of them wondering what Sarah had done to make their mother feel this way. Sarah's face flushed with anger and humiliation. "This is absurd," she spat. "I've done nothing but try to help her, and this is how she repays me?" The lawyer continued, his tone unyielding. I understand that this is difficult to comprehend, but your mother's words in the will were clear. She mentioned several instances where you, Sarah, neglected her needs, both emotionally and physically, when she needed you the most. She felt abandoned, and while she loved you, she could no longer trust you with her affairs. Sarah was silent for a moment, her jaw clenched. Her mind flashed to the times she had visited her mother only when it was convenient, or when she had been too busy with her own family to lend the emotional support Martha had needed. She had always told herself that she'd be there when the time was right, but the truth was, she had distanced herself from her mother, convinced that Martha could manage on her own. But now, in the cold, unforgiving light of the will reading, the weight of her actions came crashing down on her. The realization that her mother had cut her off was too much to bear. The silence in the room was suffocating. Mr. Jenkins shifted uncomfortably in his seat, giving Sarah a moment to collect herself, but the damage had been done. Sarah looked around the table, at her brothers, but they too were silent, their gazes full of confusion and unspoken questions. What had happened between Sarah and their mother that had led to such a drastic decision? I never thought it would come to this, Sarah murmured, more to herself than to anyone in particular. Her voice was a mixture of anger and regret. But I suppose she had her reasons. Mr. Jenkins, unfazed, continued with the reading. Moving on, David and Tom, you will receive a portion of your mother's estate. However, it is important to note that there is one condition attached. Both David and Tom straightened in their seats, listening intently. The tension had shifted, but they were still unsure of what to expect. Your mother's final wish was that the two of you would share this inheritance, but only under one condition: you must reconcile with one another, and with Ellen. The mention of Ellen sent a ripple of surprise through the room. Ellen had been Martha's childhood friend, someone who had remained a quiet but steadfast presence in Martha's life, especially in her later years. While Sarah had distanced herself from her mother, David and Tom had been too caught up in their own lives to notice how much Ellen had come to mean to Martha. What does Ellen have to do with this? Tom finally spoke, his voice quiet but filled with uncertainty. Mr. Jenkins looked at him solemnly. Ellen was the one person who truly supported your mother in her final years. She was the one who took care of her when none of you were around. Your mother was very clear in her will that no matter the circumstances, Ellen had earned the right to be a part of the inheritance. David and Tom exchanged uneasy glances. They knew Ellen, of course, she was a kind woman, but she had never been a part of their immediate family. The thought that Martha had chosen her over them was a hard pill to swallow. Sarah's face twisted with disbelief. So, you're telling me that Ellen, of all people, gets a larger share of the estate than I do? Her voice dripped with contempt. This is ridiculous. The lawyer held up a hand, signaling for calm. The estate is not solely about money or possessions. It is about the relationships that your mother valued. Ellen was more than a friend to her, she was a sister. Your mother wanted her to be acknowledged for the role she played in Martha's life. As the lawyer spoke, the tension in the room grew thicker. The children's world was crumbling before their eyes. Their mother's choices, decisions they hadn't fully understood or respected, were now taking center stage, and they couldn't help but feel blindsided. Each of them was forced to confront their own actions, their own shortcomings, and the deep, unspoken fractures in their relationships. As the lawyer closed the will, a heavy silence fell over the room. Sarah's face was flushed with anger and frustration, while David and Tom sat in stunned disbelief. They had come expecting closure, but instead, they were left with more questions than answers. What had truly happened between their mother and Sarah? Why had Martha chosen Ellen over her own children? The answers would only come in time, but for now, the family was left reeling from the shock of it all. The room remained eerily silent after the lawyer's last words, the weight of the unexpected revelation hanging over the siblings like a thick fog. Sarah sat frozen, her mind reeling with the shock of it all. She had imagined many scenarios in her head, but this betrayal from her own mother, was something she had never anticipated. The inheritance, the family home, the legacy of their mother, none of it mattered anymore. What stung most was the realization that Martha, her own flesh and blood, had made the conscious decision to sever their bond so completely that even the smallest trace of her affection had been erased. David and Tom, too, were struggling to process what they had just learned. Both of them had always known there had been distance between Sarah and Martha, but they had never imagined it had gone this far. They exchanged glances, trying to piece together the puzzle of their mother's final days. Tom, who had remained quiet for most of the reading, now seemed visibly agitated. His hands clenched into fists on the table as he stared down at the will. David, meanwhile, rubbed his temples, his thoughts a whirlwind of confusion and guilt. Ellen, the quiet, almost invisible figure in their mother's life, had been more important to her than they had realized. And yet, both brothers had neglected to see the depth of their mother's loneliness, her quiet suffering in the final years of her life. They had taken her love for granted, never once considering that Martha might have been asking for more than what they were willing to give. The anger in Sarah's eyes was evident as she slammed her palm on the table, breaking the silence. "This isn't right," she hissed, her voice laced with venom. "I've spent years of my life taking care of her, helping her, and this is what I get in return. I'm disowned in favor of some woman who was nothing more than a stranger." She stood abruptly, pushing her chair back with a screech that echoed in the otherwise silent room. Tom, always the peacemaker, flinched at his sister's outburst but said nothing. He couldn't find the words to express his own discomfort with the situation. He had always kept to himself, never fully engaging with family matters, and now he was paying the price for his detachment. David, on the other hand, couldn't hold his frustration in any longer. "Sarah, this isn't about who was there more for her," he said, his voice rising, filled with the sharp edge of guilt and anger. "It's about the fact that Mom had a life outside of us, outside of what we were willing to see. Ellen was there for her when none of us were." Sarah's eyes widened as if she had been slapped. "You're defending her," she spat. "You're actually defending her over me?" "I'm not defending anyone," David shot back. "I'm just saying that you weren't there when it mattered. Mom needed you, Sarah, and you weren't there." The words stung more than David had intended, and for a moment, Sarah's face softened with a mix of anger and regret. She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. The truth hung in the air, thick with guilt. She had failed her mother. The room grew quieter, the tension now thick and suffocating. Mr. Jenkins, who had been a passive observer of the growing family drama, cleared his throat, trying to regain control of the situation. "I understand that emotions are running high," he said, his voice gentle yet firm. "But I must remind you that your mother's wishes are clear. We must all respect her decisions, no matter how difficult they may be to accept." The words felt cold, detached, as if they were coming from someone who had no personal stake in the family's heartbreak. But the siblings knew he was right. Martha's decisions were final, and the law would not be bent to accommodate their feelings. They were left with nothing but their fractured relationships and the painful realization that they had never truly understood their mother. The will had shattered any illusions they had about the closeness of their family. Martha's death, once a painful but natural event, had now become a catalyst for unhealed wounds to surface. Sarah, who had always been the independent one, now seemed fragile. The anger that had burned brightly in her was slowly being replaced with something far more painful, regret. She had spent so many years pushing her mother away, thinking she would have time to mend things, never realizing that time had run out. David, too, was coming to terms with his own failings. He had always tried to be the good son, the one who kept the family together, but he had allowed his own ambitions to take precedence over the needs of the one person who had always been there for him. Tom, who had distanced himself from everyone for so long, was beginning to realize that his passivity had allowed the family to drift apart. Now, he found himself in the middle of a battle he didn't want to fight, struggling to reconcile his guilt with his indifference. It was a cruel irony that it took their mother's death for them to finally understand the depth of her love for them, but even then, it was too late. As the family sat in the lawyer's office, the reality of Martha's decisions sank in. The inheritance, the family home, the legacy of the past, it all felt meaningless now. What mattered, they realized, was the time they had wasted, the moments they had taken for granted. The thought of Ellen, so intertwined in their mother's final years, felt like a slap in the face. She had been there when they hadn't, and now, it was too late for them to make amends. The will had exposed their flaws and their regrets in the most painful way possible. And now, they were left with the task of picking up the shattered pieces of their family. With the reading of the will concluded, the siblings left the lawyer's office in silence, each retreating into their own thoughts. The anger had not subsided, but there was something else, something deeper, that lingered. Guilt. Regret. The knowledge that their mother's love had been far greater than any material inheritance. Days passed after the will reading, but the storm of emotions within the family didn't subside. The house, once a place filled with laughter and shared memories, now felt like a hollow shell. It had always been Martha's home, and with her gone, it seemed as if the walls themselves were mourning her absence. Sarah, David, and Tom each found themselves drowning in their own thoughts, struggling to find a way to move forward. Sarah was the first to break the silence. Her mind had been running in circles ever since the will was read. She couldn't shake the feeling of betrayal, but beneath the anger, something else had begun to bubble up, an uncomfortable sense of accountability. What had she really done to earn her mother's trust? What had she given Martha that could have justified the faith she was now desperately seeking in her absence? She had spent years telling herself that her mother was too demanding, that Martha had been too critical, and that their strained relationship had always been someone else's fault. But now, in the empty quiet of her own home, Sarah couldn't ignore the truth anymore. She had been the one to distance herself. And when Martha had needed her most, she hadn't been there. The anger had melted away, leaving only regret and shame in its wake. Sarah had been so focused on her own life that she had failed to see the quiet desperation in her mother's eyes. She had ignored the signs of aging, the subtle changes in Martha's behavior that now seemed glaringly obvious. Sarah's thoughts were interrupted by a knock on the door. When she opened it, she found Tom standing there, looking as though he had been on the verge of turning away. He didn't say anything at first, just stepped inside and sat down in the living room without a word. His presence, once a rare comfort, now felt like an unsettling reminder of how disconnected they had all become. "We need to talk," Tom said finally, breaking the silence. His voice was low, heavy with something that Sarah couldn't quite place. She sat down across from him, her heart racing. She knew this conversation was inevitable. "I can't stop thinking about everything," Tom continued. "I've been so distant. I've been so caught up in my own life that I never once stopped to think about what Mom needed from me. I was too wrapped up in my own problems to even notice she was struggling." His voice cracked, a rawness Sarah hadn't heard from him before. Tom, the one who had always avoided conflict, the one who had always kept his emotions buried beneath a veneer of indifference, was now struggling to keep himself together. "I've failed her," he admitted, the guilt in his voice unmistakable. Sarah looked at him, her own feelings of shame mirrored in his face. She had always thought of Tom as the calm, unaffected sibling, the one who didn't care much about anything. But now, she saw the cracks in his armor. "You weren't the only one," she said quietly. "I should have been there for her too. I thought I could fix everything when I was ready, but time ran out." The words hung in the air, heavy with the truth that neither of them had fully accepted until now. Their mother had been more than just a parent, she had been a constant presence in their lives, and they had both taken her for granted. "What now?" Sarah asked, her voice tinged with desperation. "We can't undo what's been done. We can't change what Mom decided. And we can't just ignore the fact that Ellen is now part of the picture." Tom didn't respond immediately. He seemed lost in thought, his eyes far away as he processed everything. Finally, he looked back at Sarah, his expression resolute. "I think it's time we talked to Ellen," he said. The idea of facing Ellen made Sarah's stomach churn. Ellen, the woman who had quietly been there for their mother, the woman who had taken on a role none of them had ever seen coming. Sarah had never understood her mother's attachment to Ellen, never realized how close they had become over the years. But now, as uncomfortable as it made her, it was clear that Ellen held the key to understanding the choices their mother had made. "Do you really think she'll want to talk to us?" Sarah asked, her voice tinged with doubt. "After everything that's happened?" Tom nodded. "She's always been the one to bridge the gaps. She understood Mom better than any of us. If we don't try to make things right, then we're just as guilty as we've always been." The decision was made. The following morning, Tom and Sarah found themselves standing in front of Ellen's house, the weight of the moment pressing down on them. Neither of them had spoken to Ellen in years, not since their mother's funeral, and now they were about to confront her with all the uncomfortable truths they had ignored for far too long. Ellen answered the door with a warm smile, though her eyes betrayed a deeper understanding of the situation. "Sarah, Tom," she said softly, stepping aside to let them in. "I've been expecting you." The house was cozy, much like Martha's had been, filled with warm colors and soft light. Ellen offered them tea, but neither of them had the appetite for it. They sat down in the living room, the silence between them almost palpable. Ellen studied them for a moment, her gaze steady and knowing. "I'm guessing you've come to talk about the will," she said, breaking the tension. Sarah nodded slowly, unsure of where to begin. "Ellen, we don't really know what to say," she started, her voice trembling slightly. "We're sorry for everything. For not being there for Mom the way we should have. For not understanding what she needed." Ellen listened quietly, her face softening. "Your mother was a remarkable woman," she said after a long pause. "She loved all of you, even if she didn't always show it the way you wanted her to. But she didn't want to be a burden. And she didn't want to feel abandoned." Tom's throat tightened, and Sarah could see the tears welling in his eyes. "I wish I had done more for her," he murmured. "I should have been there." Ellen reached out, placing a gentle hand on his. "It's not too late," she said quietly. "Your mother always believed in second chances. If you want to make things right, you can." The conversation stretched into the afternoon, with Ellen sharing stories of her years with Martha, stories of love, laughter, and deep bonds that had formed during the hardest times. Slowly, the siblings began to understand what they had missed. They had been so caught up in their own lives that they hadn't seen the toll their absence had taken on their mother. And now, Ellen was the one showing them the way forward, offering them a path to reconciliation. When they left Ellen's house, there was a sense of peace, however fragile. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time in a long while, they felt like they could face the future, together. The weeks that followed the conversation with Ellen were filled with a quiet kind of transformation. Sarah, David, and Tom had begun to rebuild the broken connections with their mother's memory, though it felt like piecing together fragments of something irreparably shattered. The guilt they had carried for so long began to loosen its grip on their hearts, but there were still moments when the weight of their past choices crushed them. Sarah, in particular, found herself reflecting on the years she had spent running from the very things that mattered most. She'd always thought she had time to fix things, time to make amends, time to be the daughter her mother had hoped she'd be. But time, it seemed, had slipped away faster than she could grasp. As Sarah drove to the family home, the house that had once been full of Martha's vibrant energy, she couldn't help but feel a deep sense of loss. The garden, which had always been so meticulously cared for, was now overgrown with weeds. The walls, once adorned with photos of family milestones, were bare and lonely. The space, which had once felt so warm, now felt like a shadow of what it had been. She paused at the front door, her hand on the handle, unsure of what to expect. It was as though she had to gather the courage to walk into a place that held so many painful memories. She wasn't sure if she was ready to face it all. But the knock on the door of the house that day, another visit, this time with David and Tom, marked the beginning of their attempt to make things right. They didn't expect immediate closure, but they were determined to at least be present, to show up when it counted. When they finally stepped inside, they were met with the unmistakable presence of Ellen. She had been the glue that had kept everything together, not just for Martha in her final years but for all of them when they couldn't find the strength to hold their family together. Ellen had become the surrogate daughter to Martha in her last chapter, and now she was an irreplaceable part of the healing process. Her acceptance of the siblings' regrets didn't erase the past, but it opened a door to a future where they could slowly rebuild. "I never thought I'd see the day you three would come back here together," Ellen said with a bittersweet smile. She gestured to the couch, where they all sat, the heaviness of the past still thick in the air. Sarah couldn't help but wonder how different things could have been had she been more present. But the truth was clear now, her mother had needed all of them, even though their selfishness had caused the rift. Ellen's words, although soft, hit hard. "Your mother loved you deeply, and she was proud of you, even in the moments when she couldn't express it. But she also understood that love isn't always perfect. It's messy. Sometimes, it's painful." She knew that, Ellen said, her voice thick with emotion. "That's why she made the decisions she did." Tom, ever the quiet one, nodded thoughtfully. He had been processing everything in his own way. This wasn't easy for him, but he understood now that he could no longer avoid confronting his part in the family's dysfunction. He had been distant, yes, but more than that, he had been afraid. Afraid of facing the raw truth, afraid of being judged, afraid of the confrontation that had been brewing for years. Now, though, he was ready. "I'm sorry, Ellen," he said, his voice steady but sincere. "I've been selfish, too. I didn't want to get involved in the mess. But you were always there when we couldn't be, and for that, I'll always be grateful." Ellen squeezed his hand, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "I'm not looking for gratitude, Tom. But it means the world to me that you're here now. Your family. All of you are." With those words, the walls between them started to crumble. It wasn't immediate, and there wasn't some grand epiphany, but little by little, the healing began. The siblings talked about the past, acknowledged their mistakes, and expressed their gratitude for Ellen's unwavering support. They realized that the family bond they had long ignored wasn't a one-way street, it had been up to all of them to nurture it, to protect it. Now, standing in the place that had once felt like a war zone, they saw a glimmer of hope, a chance to rebuild something meaningful. As the days turned into weeks, the family dynamics began to shift. Sarah started visiting the family home more often, not with the intention of reclaiming what she felt had been taken from her, but to embrace what was still there, the memories of the woman who had loved them fiercely, even when they hadn't been capable of returning that love. Tom, who had always kept his distance, began to open up more, letting go of the resentment he had carried for years. He started taking small steps to engage with the family, spending time with David and Sarah, and even making the effort to check in with Ellen. It was clear that he still had a long way to go, but the fact that he was trying meant everything. David, too, found himself reflecting on his own life and the choices he had made. He had spent so much time trying to play the role of the good son, the one who held it all together, that he had neglected the emotional side of the relationship. He had been more concerned with appearances than with the actual needs of his mother. Now, he was finally seeing things clearly, seeing his own flaws and the way they had impacted the family. The healing process wasn't easy. There were many moments of doubt, many moments when they questioned whether they could ever truly heal the wounds of the past. But there was also a sense of unity that hadn't existed before. For the first time in a long while, Sarah, David, and Tom were acting as a family again, not just as siblings who had shared the same parents. They were finally learning to love each other, not perfectly, but with understanding, with compassion, and with the hope that they could build something stronger this time around. They decided to host a small ceremony in their mother's honor, a way to celebrate her life and the love she had given them. It wasn't grand or extravagant, but it felt right, an intimate gathering, filled with stories and memories of Martha. As they gathered together in the backyard of the family home, overlooking the garden that their mother had once tended to with such care, Sarah couldn't help but feel a sense of peace. The house was no longer just a place of pain, it had become a place of healing, a symbol of the love they were slowly but surely restoring. Ellen, standing alongside them, had become the bridge between their past and their future. She had given them the courage to face the truth, to see what they had been too blind to recognize before. It wasn't easy, but it was real. And for the first time in years, they felt like a family again. Months passed, and the family continued their tentative journey of healing. Sarah, Tom, and David found themselves in a new rhythm of life, one where the scars of their past began to fade, though they would never be fully gone. Each of them had made peace with the reality of their mother's death, but it was through their collective efforts, their willingness to step into the difficult emotional terrain they had avoided for so long, that they began to understand the true depth of what Martha had left behind. It wasn't just about money or possessions, it was the legacy of love, sacrifice, and the quiet strength their mother had embodied. As they started to accept their part in the family's disintegration, they began to see that their healing wasn't just about reconciling with their past, but also about transforming how they would live their lives moving forward. Ellen remained an integral part of this transformation. Initially, they had seen her as the outsider, an uninvited guest in their family's drama. But now, she was the thread that held them together. She had shown them what real love and loyalty meant. She had been the one to step up when they had faltered, to act as the pillar when the foundation was crumbling. Sarah found herself reaching out to Ellen more frequently, not out of obligation but out of genuine affection. Ellen had become like a second mother to her. Tom, who had once been so reticent, began to spend more time with her too, not just to reconcile his past actions, but because he realized he didn't want to lose her. Her presence was a calming force that softened the hard edges of his life. As for David, he found himself calling Ellen for advice on everything, from relationships to personal growth. She had become more than a companion to their mother, she had become a mentor, a guide, a beacon of clarity in a world that often felt chaotic. The family's newfound bond didn't come without its challenges, though. One day, after a quiet evening spent reminiscing about their childhood, Sarah and Tom found themselves discussing the future of their mother's estate. It was clear that Ellen had a significant claim to it, but the siblings, though deeply grateful for all she had done, still wrestled with the idea that their mother's inheritance might go beyond what was expected. It wasn't just money, it was what the inheritance represented, their mother's love, her values, her final testament. They had always assumed they would be the ones to inherit it, but they now realized that what mattered most wasn't the wealth, but the lessons Martha had passed down. Ellen, as they had come to understand, had been chosen by their mother to carry on that legacy. In many ways, she had become the living embodiment of everything their mother had wanted for them, and it felt only fitting that she should be part of the inheritance. The issue was uncomfortable to discuss, and it caused some friction between them. Sarah, especially, felt torn. On one hand, she wanted to honor her mother's decision. On the other hand, a small part of her felt betrayed by the will and its unexpected twists. But as time went on, Sarah began to see the bigger picture. Their mother had always been wise in ways they hadn't fully appreciated until now. Martha's will had been her way of ensuring that the family would be forced to confront their own shortcomings, their own unhealed wounds. It was a wake-up call to remind them that family was not about entitlement, but about support and respect. The day of the final reading came months after the initial shock, and by then, the tension had settled into a quiet acceptance. They all gathered together, Sarah, Tom, David, and Ellen, sitting in the same room where the original reading had taken place. The atmosphere was different now, softer, as though the weight of the past had somehow been lifted. Martha's lawyer, a stern man in his late 50s, stood at the front, his voice steady as he began to read through the clauses once again. There were some provisions that had been altered, some that had remained unchanged. The house, the one they had all grown up in, was to be sold, and the proceeds were to be divided evenly between them, but there was one key difference: Ellen was to receive a substantial portion of the inheritance as well, a gesture that spoke volumes of Martha's trust in her. The rest of the assets, including smaller possessions and sentimental objects, were distributed according to their mother's wishes, but Martha had made one thing abundantly clear: she had wanted them all to work together in ensuring that the family's bonds remained strong, that their relationships were mended, and that the love she had always tried to cultivate would live on beyond her death. The will had been Martha's final message, a message that transcended money, possessions, and even the most tangible legacies. It was a message of healing, of giving and receiving love, and of accepting each other's flaws and imperfections. As the lawyer finished reading, there was a long silence in the room. It wasn't uncomfortable this time, but rather reflective. Sarah looked around at Tom and David, at Ellen, who was sitting beside them with her quiet, knowing smile. The pain of the past still lingered, but it was no longer the overpowering force it had once been. The siblings had learned, through their shared grief and growth, that forgiveness wasn't just about excusing each other's mistakes, it was about accepting that they were all human, all flawed, and all deserving of second chances. "Mom always knew how to get through to us," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. Tom nodded, his eyes filled with unshed tears. "She was tough on us, but she loved us. We just couldn't see it at the time." David, ever the pragmatic one, cleared his throat. "She did what we couldn't. She put the pieces back together, even after we'd broken them." Ellen smiled softly. "She had faith in all of you. She knew that, in time, you'd come back to each other. She just had to help you get there." The realization hit all at once: their mother had never been about the money, the inheritance, or the tangible things. She had been about family, about love, about passing down the wisdom of life, things they would carry with them long after her death. The inheritance wasn't the end, it was the beginning of something new. As they left the lawyer's office that day, they didn't just leave behind the legacy of a woman who had shaped their lives in ways they could never fully understand. They left with something far more precious: the chance to build their own legacy, together. The road ahead would still have its challenges, but they now had the tools to face them, knowing that, with each other's help, they could weather anything that came their way. And that, in the end, was the greatest gift their mother had given them.